A blast of frigid air struck the Chinese delegation as they stepped through the doorway of the State Department building in Washington, D.C., summer 1972. Outside, the Capitol sweltered under a punishing 95-degree heat wave. Inside, it was a crisp 68 degrees. Foreign Minister Xi Pengfei visibly shivered, buttoning his Mao suit as he whispered to an aide, "Why do Americans live like they're inside refrigerators?" This moment, seemingly trivial amid historic Nixon-era diplomacy, revealed a profound cultural divide that would shape Sino-American relations for decades. The Chinese officials weren't merely experiencing physical discomfort, they were witnessing American technological abundance that contradicted everything they'd been told about capitalist decay. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. To understand the Chinese reaction to America's ubiquitous air conditioning, we must first understand the parallel technological trajectories of these two superpowers in the decades following World War II. While Americans increasingly treated cooling as a basic necessity, most Chinese citizens, even high-ranking officials, had never experienced artificial cooling beyond industrial settings. What Americans took for granted was, to visiting Chinese, an incomprehensible luxury that symbolized a fundamental divergence in development models and everyday life. The story begins not with diplomatic missions, but in American factories during World War II. The massive industrial mobilization of 1941-1945 saw air conditioning installed in defense plants nationwide to control humidity for ammunition production and improve worker efficiency in shipyards and aircraft factories. Carrier Engineering Corporation, founded by the father of air conditioning Willis Carrier, received government contracts worth millions to climate control critical war facilities. By 1944, over 20,000 industrial air conditioning units operated across America, setting the stage for the technology's rapid post-war civilian adoption. As soldiers returned from global battlefields in 1945 and 1946, they fueled an unprecedented economic boom. Their wartime experiences had exposed many to air conditioning for the first time in military hospitals, command centers, and overseas installations in hot climates. These veterans, armed with GI Bill benefits and entering a robust job market, formed the backbone of a new middle class with disposable income and expectations of comfort unimaginable to previous generations. The transformation began in America's burgeoning entertainment venues. Movie theaters had pioneered air conditioning in the 1920s and 1930s as a competitive advantage, with large marquees proudly advertising "It's cool inside." During summer heat waves, Americans flocked to cinemas as much for the refreshing atmosphere as for the feature film. By 1947, over 30,000 theaters nationwide boasted refrigerated air, establishing cooling as an expected amenity of public spaces. Department stores quickly followed suit. Macy's, Marshall Field's, and other retail giants installed central air conditioning systems, extending shopping hours through summer months, previously considered too oppressive for commerce. "Air-conditioned for your shopping comfort" became a standard advertising tagline. The post-war consumer boom was literally cooled by Carrier, York, and General Electric units humming in the background. Corporate America embraced the technology with particular enthusiasm. The post-war office building boom featured sealed window designs only possible with mechanical ventilation. The United Nations Secretariat building, completed in 1952, exemplified this architectural revolution with its fully air-conditioned glass and steel construction. When visiting Chinese officials toured such buildings in later decades, they entered spaces designed with the assumption that environmental control was a given. Buildings that would be uninhabitably hot without their massive cooling plants. The 1950s witnessed air conditioning's decisive transition from luxury to necessity. In 1953, Henry Galson developed an affordable window unit that could be installed in homes without extensive modification. Sales exploded from 74,000 units in 1948 to over 1 million annually by 1953. The technology was democratizing, spreading from wealthy neighborhoods to middle-class suburbs. When Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev toured an American exhibition home during his famous 1959 visit, he dismissed the displayed appliances, including air conditioning, as frivolous luxuries that ordinary citizens would never afford. He would be proven spectacularly wrong. Residential air conditioning penetration reached 12% of American homes by 1960, but regional disparities were stark. Less than 5% of northeastern homes had units, while the percentage in southern states exceeded 18%. This regional disparity would significantly reshape America's demographic landscape in coming decades, enabling massive population shifts to the Sun Belt that transformed both economic geography and political alignments. President Lyndon Johnson, raised in the scorching Texas Hill Country, understood cooling's transformative potential. The air conditioner has changed the South more than anything since the Civil War, he remarked to journalists in 1965. His observation captured how cooling technology had made previously inhospitable regions viable for year-round business operations and comfortable living. Cities like Houston, Phoenix, and Miami, once seasonal destinations with summer population exoduses, were becoming major metropolitan centers. The automotive industry, meanwhile, was making cooling mobile. Packard had introduced the first car air conditioning system in 1940, but post-war engineering advances made the technology more reliable and affordable. By 1969, over half of new American cars featured optional air conditioning, with the percentage climbing to 72% by 1972. The American landscape adapted accordingly, with drive-in businesses from restaurants to banks designed around the assumption that customers would remain comfortably in their climate-controlled vehicles. Behind this cooling revolution lay complex supply chains and energy infrastructure invisible to consumers and foreign observers alike. America's robust electrical grid, expanded through New Deal rural electrification and post-war investment, provided the power foundation for millions of energy-hungry cooling units. Coal-fired plants worked at maximum capacity during summer peaks, with blackouts and brownouts becoming increasingly common as demand strained the system. The environmental consequences of this massive energy consumption remained largely unexamined in an era before climate awareness. As American cooling culture accelerated through the 1960s, China was experiencing a radically different developmental path. The People's Republic, established in 1949 after years of civil war and Japanese occupation, focused its industrial policy on heavy manufacturing, military technology, and basic infrastructure. Consumer comfort ranked low on the priority list as Mao Zedong's government emphasized collective sacrifice for national advancement. The Great Leap Forward 1958-1962, Mao's disastrous attempt to rapidly industrialize through mass mobilization, resulted in catastrophic famine and economic disruption. As millions of Chinese citizens struggled for basic sustenance, the concept of mechanical cooling for comfort was unimaginable. Even in government buildings and industrial facilities, ventilation typically relied on natural airflow, ceiling fans, and traditional architectural techniques like courtyards and cross ventilation. When the Cultural Revolution erupted in 1966, technological development took a backseat to ideological purity. Universities closed, technical experts were sent to rural areas for re-education, and foreign technology was condemned as bourgeois. Even as American suburbs hummed with the sound of air conditioners, Chinese urban residents relied on hand fans and cool water to survive summer heat. The contrast could hardly have been more pronounced. This was the context in which the first major Chinese delegations began visiting the United States after Richard Nixon's historic 1972 trip to Beijing. What these Chinese officials encountered was not just political differences, but a material reality that challenged fundamental assumptions about American society. Far from the decadent, declining capitalist power portrayed in propaganda, they found a nation where even ordinary citizens enjoyed environmental control that would be considered exceptional luxury in China. The Chinese delegation's 1972 visit to Washington coincided with one of the hottest summers on record. As they moved from air-conditioned limousines to air-conditioned buildings, many delegates found the constant temperature changes physically uncomfortable and culturally bewildering. Americans seem afraid of natural air, one official noted in his report. They seal themselves away from the elements as if nature were an enemy. Beyond physical discomfort, the Chinese visitors struggled with the resource implications. In China, electricity remained a carefully rationed resource, with frequent outages even in major cities. The seemingly wasteful American practice of cooling entire buildings, rather than just essential rooms, contradicted Chinese values of conservation and frugality. One delegation member calculated that the electricity used to cool a single American department store could power a Chinese factory, employing hundreds of workers. The most comprehensive Chinese account of America's cooling culture comes from the journals of translator Zhang Hanwen, who accompanied multiple delegations in the early 1970s. Zhang noted with amazement that Americans seemed unable to tolerate even mild heat. They speak of 85 degrees Fahrenheit as if it were an emergency, he wrote. In Beijing, we would consider such a day pleasantly warm. His detailed observations of American climate control practices were transmitted back to Chinese leaders as valuable intelligence about American social conditions. Chinese officials were particularly struck by the democratic nature of American cooling. Air conditioning wasn't limited to government officials or the wealthy, but extended to middle-class homes, affordable restaurants, and public buildings. This widespread distribution of comfort contradicted Marxist predictions about capitalism's inevitable concentration of resources among the elite. How could a system supposedly built on exploitation provide such amenities to ordinary workers? The answer lay partly in America's post-war economic model, which prioritized domestic consumption as an engine of growth. Air conditioning manufacturers had successfully transformed their product from luxury to necessity through aggressive marketing, consumer financing, and technological improvements that drove down costs. The average price of a room air conditioner fell from $350 in 1952, equivalent to $3,700 in 2025 dollars, to $150 by 1968, $1,200 in 2025 dollars, putting the technology within reach of working-class families. This consumer-driven approach contrasted sharply with China's state-directed economic planning. Chinese industry focused on production goals set by central authorities, with little attention to consumer preferences. When manufacturing capacity did extend beyond heavy industry, it prioritized basic necessities, simple clothing, bicycles, radios, rather than comfort technologies. The idea that market competition could make luxuries increasingly affordable was foreign to Chinese economic thinking. Beyond economics, the American cooling boom reflected deeper cultural attitudes toward nature, comfort, and modernity. Post-war American culture increasingly viewed technological conquest of the environment as progress. Advertisements for air conditioning units promised weather made to order and summer without sweat. Control over one's personal environment became associated with freedom and prosperity, core values of American identity during the Cold War. Chinese culture, by contrast, emphasized harmony with natural cycles rather than domination. Traditional Chinese architecture incorporated sophisticated passive cooling techniques developed over centuries. Courtyards, water features, carefully positioned windows, and seasonal living patterns all reflected an approach to summer heat that worked with nature rather than against it. Artificial cooling represented a fundamentally different relationship with the environment. This philosophical divergence emerged clearly in diplomatic facilities. When China established its first major embassy in Washington in 1973, American contractors proposed a standard sealed building design with central air conditioning. Chinese officials rejected this approach, instead requesting operable windows and minimizing the cooling system size. The resulting building represented a compromise between traditional Chinese design principles and American technological expectations. Meanwhile, the American embassy in Beijing, established in the same period, imported American HVAC equipment at considerable expense to create a familiar environment for staff. This climate-controlled bubble became both practical necessity and symbolic statement, a piece of America's comfort culture transplanted to the Chinese capital. Local staff who worked in the embassy often commented on the disorienting experience of moving between the artificially cooled American zone and the seasonal rhythms of Beijing. As Chinese delegations continued visiting America throughout the 1970s, their reports on air conditioning evolved from initial shock to strategic analysis. Senior officials began questioning how China might selectively adopt cooling technology to improve industrial productivity while avoiding what they saw as American excess. Scientific and engineering delegations received specific instructions to study air conditioning systems in American factories, where similar production occurred in China. A pivotal moment came in 1977 when Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping, who would soon become China's paramount leader, toured Boeing's manufacturing facilities in Seattle. Unlike previous officials who commented on the plant's air conditioning as extravagant, Deng asked detailed questions about how controlled humidity and temperature improved precision manufacturing and reduced defect rates. His practical approach signaled a shift from ideological rejection to selective adoption of Western technology. This visit coincided with broader reconsideration of China's developmental path following Mao's death in 1976. As Deng consolidated power, he championed reform and opening up, a pragmatic approach to modernization that would selectively incorporate foreign technology and practices. Air conditioning would eventually feature in this transformation, though in distinctly Chinese form. As American officials engaged with their Chinese counterparts during this period, they rarely recognized how significantly air conditioning shaped these interactions. When the U.S. State Department hosted Chinese delegations, meeting rooms were cooled to standard American office temperatures around 68 to 72 degrees Celsius, 22 degrees. Chinese visitors routinely requested higher temperatures and open windows, leading to diplomatic compromises on thermal comfort that mirrored broader negotiation challenges. These temperature negotiations reflected deeper issues of national identity and status. American officials, accustomed to controlling their environment, viewed air conditioning as a basic professional necessity and sign of respect for important visitors. For Chinese representatives, demonstrating physical endurance and adaptability was culturally valued. Requesting special accommodation would show weakness unbecoming of representatives from a great nation. Many simply endured the cold while adding layers of clothing. Journalists covering these diplomatic exchanges noted the sartorial disparities. While American officials removed suit jackets in their perfectly cooled rooms, Chinese delegates often kept jackets buttoned and sometimes added scarves. These small adaptations symbolized broader asymmetries between a nation that had made comfort standard and one still focused on basic development. The American cooling culture that so startled Chinese observers had emerged from specific historical circumstances. World War II not only popularized air conditioning through industrial applications, but created the economic conditions for its post-war boom. American manufacturers, fearing recession as war production ended, aggressively sought new consumer markets. Companies like Carrier, which had expanded dramatically to meet military contracts, redirected their production capacity towards civilian applications. This transition was aided by technological innovations developed under wartime pressure. Smaller compressors, more efficient coolants, and improved manufacturing techniques all emerged from defense-related research. When these advances reached consumer markets, they transformed air conditioning from custom-engineered systems to mass-produced appliances available at local department stores. Federal policy further accelerated adoption through multiple channels. The Federal Housing Administration provided guaranteed mortgages for new construction that included air conditioning, effectively subsidizing the technology's spread in residential housing. Tax policies allowed accelerated depreciation for business investments in cooling systems. Military bases nationwide installed air conditioning, exposing millions of service members to cooled environments they would later seek in civilian life. These government interventions rarely registered as industrial policy, yet they effectively established air conditioning as infrastructure rather than luxury. By the time Chinese officials began regularly visiting in the 1970s, this infrastructure was so embedded in American life that it had become invisible to Americans themselves, noticed only when it failed. The role of air conditioning in enabling particular architectural forms became especially evident to Chinese visitors touring American cities. The glass-walled skyscrapers of Manhattan, the sprawling shopping malls of suburbia, and the vast indoor spaces of institutions like hospitals and universities all depended fundamentally on mechanical cooling. Without it, these defining features of the American-built environment would be uninhabitable. This architectural dependency created vulnerability that concerned pragmatic Chinese observers. During the 1973 oil embargo, energy conservation measures included temperature restrictions in commercial buildings. Many businesses were required to maintain temperatures no lower than 78 degrees, 25.6 degrees, a mandate that caused widespread complaints from Americans accustomed to cooler indoor environments. Chinese delegates visiting during this period noted how energy dependency created strategic weaknesses in the American system. As the 1970s progressed, rising energy costs and growing environmental awareness prompted questions about America's air-conditioned lifestyle. Architect Buckminster Fuller described the standard American approach as trying to air condition the outdoors, a reference to inefficient building designs that leaked cooled air. Critics began suggesting that Americans had engineered themselves into a technological dependency that was neither sustainable nor necessary. Some Americans, particularly those in the emerging environmental movement, began advocating for climate-responsive architecture that would reduce mechanical cooling needs. Passive solar design, natural ventilation, and traditional techniques like thermal mass and shading gained attention. These approaches, ironically, had more in common with traditional Chinese building practices than with mainstream American construction. Chinese officials studying American environmental debates recognized parallels to their own cultural traditions. Reports back to Beijing increasingly distinguished between the beneficial industrial applications of air conditioning and what they viewed as excessive residential and commercial use. As China contemplated its own development path, these observations would inform a more selective approach to cooling technology. By the late 1970s, the Chinese view of American air conditioning had evolved from initial shock to nuanced assessment. What had first appeared as wasteful luxury was now recognized as a complex system with both benefits and costs. Valuable applications in healthcare, manufacturing, and food preservation could be separated from what Chinese officials continued to view as comfort-related excess. As the Carter administration emphasized energy conservation, Chinese delegations took careful note of retrofits to American buildings and revised temperature standards. The American experience provided valuable lessons as China contemplated its future relationship with cooling technology. Would China eventually follow the American path of ubiquitous air conditioning, or would it develop a distinctive approach reflecting different priorities and cultural values? The answer would emerge in the dramatic transformations of the 1980s, as Deng Xiaoping's reforms accelerated and China began its remarkable economic ascent. The relationship between these nations would shift from mutual curiosity to complex interdependence, with air conditioning playing a surprising role in China's manufacturing rise. As American factories increasingly relocated to capitalize on lower labor costs, they brought with them the technological expectations of their home country, including climate control for precision production. As Chinese officials departed Washington after diplomatic exchanges, returning to Beijing's summer heat and traditional cooling methods, they carried with them not just policy discussions but visceral experiences of American technological modernity. These personal encounters with air-conditioned America would shape decisions as China charted its development course for the coming decades. The story of how China would eventually become both the world's largest consumer and manufacturer of air conditioning units was just beginning, and it would transform global energy consumption, urban development, and climate politics in ways neither Americans nor Chinese could fully anticipate in those early days of renewed relations. The first Chinese manufactured room air conditioner rolled off the assembly line at the Haier factory in Qingdao in 1985. The unit, boxy, inefficient by Western standards, and prohibitively expensive for most Chinese citizens, represented the beginning of a new era. Few could have predicted that within 3 decades, China would produce 70% of the world's air conditioners, transforming global markets while simultaneously experiencing the world's fastest domestic adoption of cooling technology. This remarkable transition emerged directly from the culture shock experienced by those early diplomatic delegations to air-conditioned America. Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up policies created the conditions for this transformation. After consolidating power in the late 1970s, Deng abandoned many of Mao's ideological positions in favor of pragmatic development. His famous dictum, "It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice," signaled a new willingness to adopt effective technologies regardless of their capitalist associations. Air conditioning, once viewed with suspicion as wasteful luxury, was reconceptualized as a modern productivity tool. The initial focus remained industrial. Chinese factories, particularly those in the textile, electronics, and precision engineering sectors, installed air conditioning to control humidity and dust, improving product quality to compete in international markets. Unlike the American pattern where consumer applications led industrial ones, China's air conditioning adoption began with manufacturing and only later expanded to commercial and residential markets. China's approach to technology transfer differed significantly from previous developing nations. Rather than simply importing American units, Chinese leadership insisted on joint ventures that would build domestic manufacturing capacity. In 1984, China entered a historic agreement with American air conditioning pioneer Carrier Corporation to establish a manufacturing facility in Shanghai. The arrangement required Carrier to share technical expertise with Chinese engineers and gradually increase local content in the production process. This strategy reflected lessons learned from observing both American successes and mistakes. Chinese planners recognized the economic and strategic value of controlling this technology rather than becoming dependent on imports. By insisting on knowledge transfer rather than just finished products, China positioned itself to eventually compete with the very companies that helped establish its industry. The early Chinese units, built under licenses from American, Japanese, and European manufacturers, served primarily commercial and industrial clients. 5-star hotels catering to international business travelers were among the first commercial buildings to feature central air conditioning. These climate-controlled spaces functioned as business interfaces between China and the outside world, allowing foreign visitors to work comfortably while experiencing China on carefully managed terms. Government buildings adopted air conditioning more selectively than their American counterparts. Rather than cooling entire structures, Chinese administrative buildings typically cooled only meeting rooms used for important functions and offices of senior officials. This differentiated approach reflected both resource constraints and cultural values around hierarchy and appropriate use of technology. The 1990s brought accelerating change as China's economic reforms gained momentum. Urban middle-class professionals, often with international exposure through business or education, began demanding air-conditioned workplaces. Office buildings in special economic zones like Shenzhen and the Pudong district of Shanghai increasingly featured central air conditioning, though rarely cooled to the low temperatures common in America. Residential air conditioning followed a distinctive pattern that reflected China's unique urban development. Unlike American suburbia with detached single-family homes, China's housing boom produced massive apartment complexes housing thousands of families. These developments typically didn't include central air conditioning, instead featuring architectural provisions for individual unit installation. The ubiquitous exterior feature of Chinese apartment buildings became the mounting brackets and condensate drains for millions of individual units. As manufacturing scaled up through the 1990s, Chinese companies rapidly improved their technical capabilities. What began as licensed production of foreign designs evolved into domestic innovation. Companies like Haier, Midea, and Gree invested heavily in research and development, gradually closing the efficiency gap with Japanese and American manufacturers. By 2000, Chinese brands commanded 40% of the domestic market, up from less than 20% just 5 years earlier. This manufacturing capacity had global implications. As production costs fell, Chinese air conditioners became increasingly competitive in international markets. American retailers like Walmart, Home Depot, and Lowe's began sourcing private label units from Chinese factories. By 2005, over 30% of room air conditioners sold in the United States were manufactured in China, a remarkable reversal of the technology flow that had so impressed those early Chinese visitors. The Chinese consumer market, meanwhile, was experiencing explosive growth. Urban household air conditioning ownership rose from less than 1% in 1990 to approximately 30% by 2000. This growth coincided with rising incomes from China's economic boom and falling unit prices from manufacturing scale. A basic room air conditioner that cost 3 months' salary for an average urban worker in 1990 required only 2 weeks' income by 2000. Regional patterns of adoption revealed cultural and climatic factors at work. Southern cities like Guangzhou and Shenzhen, with their hot, humid summers, led residential adoption. Northern cities like Beijing, despite experiencing intense but shorter summer heat, followed more slowly. This reflected both climate differences and regional approaches to thermal comfort shaped by centuries of traditional architecture adapted to local conditions. The government's approach to residential air conditioning revealed complex priorities. Unlike the American government, which had actively promoted air conditioning through housing policies and energy subsidies, Chinese authorities initially neither encouraged nor discouraged household adoption. As units became affordable for middle-class urbanites, however, officials recognized their political significance as symbols of modern prosperity and quality of life improvements under Communist Party leadership. This political dimension became explicit during the 2001 campaign for Beijing to host the 2008 Olympic Games. Government presentations highlighted the city's modernization, including widespread air conditioning in accommodations, venues, and transportation. The ability to provide international standard comfort for athletes and visitors became part of China's statement that it had arrived as a modern nation capable of hosting global events. Behind this growing cooling boom lay significant infrastructure challenges. China's electrical grid, though expanding rapidly, struggled to meet peak demand during summer heat waves. Brownouts and rolling blackouts became common in urban areas as millions of air conditioners activated simultaneously on hot afternoons. By 2004, air conditioning accounted for approximately 15% of China's total electricity consumption and up to 40% of urban peak load. This infrastructure pressure prompted policy responses that differed from American approaches. Rather than simply building more power plants, Chinese authorities implemented differential pricing that made electricity significantly more expensive during peak hours. Public education campaigns encouraged setting temperatures no lower than 26 parsecs, 78.8 degrees, considerably warmer than American standards. These measures reflected both practical necessity and cultural values around resource consumption. The environmental implications of China's cooling revolution became increasingly apparent in the early 2000s. Beyond electricity consumption, air conditioner manufacturing and operation involved refrigerants with high global warming potential. As China became the world's factory for cooling equipment, it also became a major source of these chemicals. International pressure mounted for China to adopt more climate-friendly alternatives, leading to complex negotiations that balanced development priorities with environmental concerns. Chinese innovation in cooling technology accelerated through government incentives and market competition. By 2010, Chinese manufacturers had surpassed many Western companies in developing energy-efficient models. Inverter technology, which varies compressor speed rather than cycling on and off, achieved particular success in the Chinese market. These more sophisticated units cost more initially, but consumed less electricity, appealing to increasingly energy-conscious Chinese consumers facing rising utility bills. The market segmentation that emerged revealed distinctly Chinese characteristics. While American air conditioning had developed relatively uniform standards of cooling, Chinese manufacturers offered products reflecting different regional preferences and usage patterns. Northern Chinese consumers, accustomed to centralized heating but not cooling, embraced heat pump units that provided both winter warming and summer cooling. Southern consumers, facing longer cooling seasons, prioritized dehumidification features and lower operating costs over heating capability. As China's domestic market matured, manufacturers increasingly looked abroad for growth. The Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013, created new opportunities for Chinese air conditioning exports to developing nations across Asia and Africa. Countries with climates and development stages similar to China's recent past became particularly important markets. From Pakistan to Nigeria, Chinese cooling units appeared in growing middle-class households following patterns established in China's own development. This global expansion carried cultural influences as well as technology. Chinese approaches to air conditioning, including higher temperature settings and targeted cooling of specific spaces rather than entire buildings, began influencing international practices. As concerns about climate change intensified, some Western engineers and architects looked to Chinese models of selective cooling as potentially more sustainable than American-style comprehensive climate control. Back in America, the cooling landscape continued evolving. By 2010, residential air conditioning had reached near saturation in most regions, with over 87% of households nationwide having some form of cooling. Regional distinctions persisted, however, with almost universal central air conditioning in southern states, contrasting with more limited adoption in the Northeast and Pacific Northwest. American cultural attitudes toward air conditioning also showed signs of change. Environmental concerns, rising energy costs, and renewed interest in climate-responsive architecture led some Americans to question the necessity of maintaining 70 degrees, 24 degrees Celsius, indoors, regardless of outside conditions. The concept of adaptive comfort, the idea that humans can acclimate to a wider range of temperatures than previously assumed, gained traction among sustainability advocates. These shifting American perspectives created interesting convergences with traditional Chinese approaches. Passive cooling techniques like strategic ventilation, shading, and thermal mass, long employed in Chinese vernacular architecture, received renewed attention in American green building movements. The U.S. Green Building Council's LEED certification system began awarding points for reduced reliance on mechanical cooling, effectively validating approaches more aligned with Chinese traditions than mainstream American practice. As Chinese officials and business leaders continued visiting the United States in the 2010s, their experiences of American cooling culture differed markedly from those early delegations. Many had air conditioning in their own homes and offices, making the American environment less shocking. Some even commented that American buildings felt uncomfortably cold compared to Chinese standards, reversing the earlier dynamic. The COVID-19 pandemic brought unexpected dimensions to the air conditioning relationship. As both countries grappled with an airborne virus, the role of HVAC systems in disease transmission received unprecedented scrutiny. Chinese expertise in filtration technology, developed partly in response to urban air pollution challenges, proved valuable in designing systems that could reduce viral spread. Engineers from both nations collaborated on developing guidelines for safer building ventilation, a remarkable example of cooperation amid deteriorating bilateral relations. By 2023, air conditioning had become a significant component of the U.S.-China climate dialogue. As the world's two largest carbon emitters sought pathways to reduce environmental impact, cooling energy consumption represented both challenge and opportunity. Joint research initiatives focused on next-generation refrigerants, ultra-efficient compressors, and smart systems that could maintain comfort with minimal energy use. The cultural exchange had come full circle. China, once shocked by America's cooling practices, had become an innovation leader pushing the technology's evolution. American engineers increasingly studied Chinese approaches to selective cooling and variable comfort standards. What began as a one-way transfer of technology had evolved into a complex dialogue reflecting each nation's values, constraints, and developmental paths. For ordinary citizens in both countries, these high-level exchanges remained largely invisible. A Chinese office worker in Shanghai, adjusting her split-unit air conditioner on a humid summer day, gave little thought to the diplomatic exchanges that had helped bring this technology to her home. An American family in Phoenix, Arizona, running central air conditioning through the desert summer, rarely considered how their comfort connected to global manufacturing networks centered in Chinese industrial cities. Yet this invisible connection represents one of the most consequential technology transfers in modern history. The air conditioner, once a symbol of American abundance that shocked Chinese observers, has become a global technology shaped by both cultures. The manufacturing expertise concentrated in Chinese factories produces the machines that cool American homes, while American technical standards and market expectations influence Chinese product development. Looking toward future decades, both nations face similar challenges around sustainable cooling. As climate change produces more frequent and intense heat waves, access to cooling becomes increasingly critical to public health. Yet the energy demands of conventional air conditioning contribute to the very warming they mitigate. This paradox requires innovation beyond either the American approach of unlimited cooling or the traditional Chinese acceptance of seasonal discomfort. Promising directions include advanced materials that passively reject heat, smart systems that cool people rather than entire spaces, and integration of renewable energy with thermal storage to shift cooling load away from grid peaks. Chinese manufacturers and American research institutions are both advancing these technologies, often through collaborative efforts that transcend political tensions. The societal impacts of air conditioning continue evolving in both nations. In China, cooling access has become an equity issue, as rural migrants to urban areas often occupy housing without adequate cooling during dangerous heat events. Government programs increasingly recognize air conditioning as public health infrastructure rather than luxury, particularly for vulnerable populations like the elderly. This evolution mirrors earlier developments in American cities where cooling centers and subsidized units for low-income residents became common in the 1990s and 2000s. Educational approaches also show interesting convergence. American schools increasingly incorporate lessons about appropriate cooling use and energy conservation, while Chinese educational materials emphasize the balance between comfort and sustainability. Young people in both nations are growing up with more nuanced understandings of cooling technology than previous generations who either lacked access or took it for granted. Architecture in both countries shows signs of rebalancing mechanical and passive approaches. Chinese designers, while embracing modern technology, increasingly incorporate traditional wisdom about orientation, thermal mass, and natural ventilation. American architects, particularly those focused on sustainability, study these same principles to reduce cooling loads. The resulting hybrid approaches potentially offer more resilient comfort than either tradition alone. For diplomatic facilities, the temperature gap has narrowed considerably. The American Embassy in Beijing, renovated in 2008, incorporated significantly more climate-responsive design than its predecessor, reducing cooling loads while maintaining comfort. Chinese diplomatic facilities in Washington now feature sophisticated HVAC systems calibrated to intermediate temperatures that accommodate both American and Chinese preferences. When President Xi Jinping visited the United States in 2015, temperature settings for meeting rooms received specific attention in protocol arrangements. Settings of 23-24 degrees, 73-75 degrees represented a compromise between traditional American and Chinese preferences, literally a warming of the American standard and cooling of the Chinese one. This small but symbolic accommodation reflected broader recognition of cultural differences in thermal comfort. The business implications of these converging approaches are substantial. American companies operating in China have largely adapted to local temperature standards, both to reduce operating costs and to align with cultural expectations. Chinese companies establishing American facilities typically install cooling systems that can maintain lower temperatures expected by American workers, while incorporating efficiency features developed for the Chinese market. Tourism between the nations has created interesting adaptation challenges. American visitors to China during summer months often comment on warmer indoor temperatures than they're accustomed to, while Chinese tourists in America frequently find shopping malls and hotels uncomfortably cold. Tour operators in both countries now routinely advise on appropriate clothing layers for these different thermal environments. Educational exchanges have been particularly affected by these differing comfort standards. Chinese students attending American universities frequently mention adjustment to intensive air conditioning as part of their cultural adaptation process. American students studying in China similarly note the different approach to summer heat as a meaningful cultural difference, though one that receives less attention than food, language, or social customs. As both countries face aging populations, the health implications of cooling practices gain importance. Research increasingly indicates that constant exposure to air conditioning may reduce human heat tolerance over time, potentially increasing vulnerability during power outages or equipment failures. Both American and Chinese public health authorities now recommend acclimatization practices that maintain some connection to natural temperature variations rather than constant artificial environments. Energy security concerns further complicate the cooling relationship. Both nations recognize that their electricity grids face increasing stress from cooling demand, particularly as climate change intensifies summer heat. Strategic planning increasingly incorporates cooling as critical infrastructure requiring resilience measures like microgrids, thermal storage, and backup systems for critical facilities. The story of Chinese officials' shock at American air conditioning ultimately reveals how technologies embody cultural values and development priorities. What Americans created as a solution to productivity and comfort challenges reflected their particular historical circumstances, resource availability, and cultural attitudes toward nature. What Chinese observers initially perceived as wasteful excess contained elements they would selectively adapt for their own development path. The resulting global cooling landscape reflects this complex exchange. Today's most advanced systems often combine Chinese manufacturing efficiency, American technical standards, and sustainability principles drawn from both traditions and global environmental science. The air conditioner, once a symbol of separation between these cultures, has become a technology that embodies their interdependence. For individuals experiencing these systems, the changes manifest in everyday choices and expectations. An American homeowner installing a new cooling system today likely selects a higher temperature set point than their parents would have, operates the system more selectively, and probably owns a unit manufactured in China. A Chinese apartment dweller uses a system more efficient than early Chinese models, controls it with a smartphone app, and sets the temperature several degrees cooler than their grandparents would have considered appropriate. These individual adaptations, multiplied across billions of users, shape global energy consumption and climate impact. The choices made in American suburbs and Chinese apartment towers collectively determine whether cooling technology exacerbates climate change or becomes part of its solution. The dialogue between American and Chinese approaches to cooling comfort, begun in those surprised reactions of 1970s delegations, continues shaping how humanity balances comfort, development, and environmental responsibility. As we approach the mid-2020s, the air conditioning relationship between China and America has evolved into something neither side could have imagined in those early diplomatic exchanges. China has become the undisputed global leader in air conditioner manufacturing, producing over 80% of the world's units by 2022. The technology has transformed Chinese society, with urban residential ownership exceeding 70% and rapidly expanding in rural areas. Meanwhile, American cooling practices have begun incorporating efficiency innovations pioneered by Chinese manufacturers, particularly in variable refrigerant flow systems and smart controls. Climate scientists from both nations increasingly collaborate on cooling challenges, recognizing that sustainable comfort in a warming world requires combining the best elements of both approaches. The American emphasis on reliable performance and the Chinese focus on manufacturing scale and incremental efficiency gains complement each other in addressing global cooling needs. Research centers in California and Guangdong Province maintain active exchanges despite broader geopolitical tensions, focusing on next-generation technologies like solid-state cooling that could dramatically reduce energy consumption. What those shocked Chinese officials could not have anticipated in the 1970s was how their nation would ultimately transform the very technology that had so surprised them. By mastering air conditioner production and adapting it to Chinese priorities and constraints, China didn't simply adopt American technology, it reinvented it. The resulting systems, optimized for different conditions and cultural expectations, have subsequently influenced global standards and practices. For the billions of people in developing nations now experiencing rising temperatures, this Sino-American cooling dialogue has profound implications. The expansion paths of cooling technology established in these two countries provide different models for balancing immediate comfort needs with long-term sustainability. Will emerging cooling markets in India, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Brazil follow the American pattern of maximum cooling regardless of energy implications, or the more measured Chinese approach of selective application and higher temperature settings? The evidence suggests a hybrid path is emerging. Cooling technologies developed through Chinese manufacturing scale and American technical innovation are being adapted to local conditions and priorities across the global South. Indian engineers modify Chinese manufactured units to withstand voltage fluctuations common in their grid. Brazilian developers incorporate partial cooling systems that complement natural ventilation. These adaptations suggest that the future of global cooling won't simply replicate either the American or Chinese model, but synthesize elements of both with local traditions and constraints. This evolving global cooling landscape ultimately traces back to those moments of cultural collision in air-conditioned American buildings half a century ago. The Chinese officials who shivered in Washington conference rooms couldn't know they were experiencing an early chapter in one of the most consequential technology transfers of the modern era. Their physical discomfort reflected deep divergences in development priorities, resource availability, and cultural attitudes toward comfort and nature. As we face intensifying climate challenges, the story of this cultural exchange offers valuable lessons. Technologies are never neutral. They embody the values, priorities, and constraints of the societies that create them. When transferred between different cultures, they undergo transformation, adaptation, and reinterpretation. The air conditioner that spread from American innovation to Chinese manufacturing and then to global markets carried different meanings and purposes at each stage of its journey. For policymakers addressing climate change, the cooling relationship between America and China demonstrates both the challenges and opportunities of technological cooperation. Despite periods of geopolitical tension and competition, technical collaboration on cooling efficiency has continued because it serves mutual interests. As both nations confront the paradox of increasing cooling needs in a warming world, their capacity to combine innovation strengths may prove crucial for sustainable solutions. The ordinary citizens of both countries, meanwhile, rarely consider these global dimensions as they adjust their thermostats. An American family in Miami setting their central air to 72 degrees, 20 Celsius, and a Chinese family in Shanghai setting their mini-split to 26 degrees, 79 degrees, are each making choices shaped by national infrastructure, energy policies, cultural expectations, and personal preferences. These millions of daily decisions collectively determine the environmental impact of humanity's growing demand for thermal comfort. Perhaps the most profound lesson from this technological exchange is that cultural understanding matters as much as technical specifications. The early Chinese reactions to American cooling practices weren't simply about temperature preferences, but reflected fundamentally different conceptions of human-environment relationships, resource allocation, and modern comfort. Recognizing these cultural dimensions of technology might help us navigate the complex challenges of sustainable development in a diverse world. As summer temperatures continue rising globally, the dialogue between American and Chinese cooling approaches remains vital for human well-being and environmental sustainability. The future of cooling will require combining American emphasis on reliable performance, Chinese manufacturing efficiency, and traditional wisdom from both cultures about living comfortably with natural cycles. The shocked reactions of those first Chinese delegations to air-conditioned America have evolved into one of the most important technological conversations of our time, one that will shape how billions of people experience both comfort and climate in the decades to come.